Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey that requires us to strip away every modern comfort we hold dear, forcing us to confront the raw, unpolished reality of human endurance in its most extreme form. We begin with the brilliance of the Mongol Empire, an entity forged not in the marble halls of comfortable palaces, but in the brutal crucible of the Eurasian steppe, built by Genghis Khan, a figure who rose from the destitution of a kidnapped orphan to become the architect of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. To understand this, we must cast aside our contemporary lens of morality and comfort and step into a world where survival was the only religion that truly mattered. Imagine, if you will, waking up near the banks of the Onon River, not to the sound of an alarm or the warmth of central heating, but to the biting frost that has already settled on your eyelashes. You are wrapped in layers of rough wool that carry the distinct, pungent scent of damp yak and wood smoke, a smell that has permeated every pore of your skin. The sun has not yet breached the horizon, and the world is painted in shades of gray and freezing blue. There is a sound, rhythmic and heavy, right beside your head. It is the breathing of your horse. In this world, the demarcation between human and animal is thin, almost non-existent. Your horse is not merely a beast of burden or a pet. He is your heating system, your transport, your comrade, and in the direst of winters, he is your potential sustenance. He steps on the edge of your coat, breathing a cloud of steam into the frigid air, offering no apology, for on the steppe, apologies are a waste of breath. And the camp is already stirring, a hive of silent, efficient motion. There is no idle chatter, no morning pleasantries, for the Mongol culture is one of extreme pragmatism. A boy, perhaps no older than 10, gallops past you with a bow slung across his back that seems too large for his small frame. Yet he rides with a fluidity that suggests he was born in the saddle. In many ways, he was. To be Mongol is to ride. You tighten your sash, gather your meager possessions, and mount up. There is no breakfast table, no moment of reflection. You chew on a strip of dried meat, borts, as you ride. It is tough, requiring a jaw strength that you will develop out of necessity, not desire. The wind here is not a weather phenomenon. It is a physical assault, a constant, flaying force that cuts sideways, seeking any gap in your armor of wool and fur. By the time you have crossed the third ridge, your face is numb, a sensation you learn to ignore because complaining is a luxury of the settled world. Here, you are either moving or you are dying. The symbiosis between the warrior and the horse is the fundamental technology of this empire. You switch mounts multiple times a day, not because you are exhausted, but to preserve the animal's strength. For a Mongol warrior without a horse is merely a man waiting to be killed. You learn to perform every biological function from the saddle, eating, sleeping, even relieving yourself. Because the column does not stop. To stop is to be left behind. And to be left behind on the steppe is a sentence of death by exposure or wolves. The hunger you feel is constant, a dull ache that sharpens your senses. When sustenance is offered, and it comes in the form of a leather sack filled with arag, fermented mare's milk. To the uninitiated palate, it is a shock. Sour, slightly effervescent, and acrid, tasting of the very sweat of the animal it came from, yet this white, fizzy liquid is life itself, packed with the calories and vitamins necessary to survive a diet almost entirely void of vegetables. You drink it because it burns, and the burn tells you it is working, keeping the bacteria of the gut alive and the cold at bay. The food is equally utilitarian. Mutton that has been dried to the consistency of wood or curd, sun-dried dairy curds that are as hard as stones. You do not eat for pleasure. You eat to fuel the machine of your body. Dinner, when it comes, is a communal affair around a fire fueled by dried dung, the only timber available on the treeless plains. So there are no tables, no napkins, only the silent, focused consumption of boiled meat. You watch an elder slice meat with a blade that has seen more war than you have seen years, his focus absolute. You learn quickly that curiosity is a deficit here. You eat what is given, you do not ask questions, and you do not waste a single morsel. The fat is the prize, the greasy, rich sweet that coats your throat and provides the insulation your body screams for. Hygiene, as you understand it, is a forgotten concept. In the Mongol worldview, washing with fresh water is an affront to the spirits of the water, a waste of a precious resource that belongs to the earth. You are coated in a layer of grease, soot, and animal fat, a second skin that protects you from the wind and the parasites. Lice are not an infestation. They are constant companions, managed but never eradicated. You smell of the herd, of blood and of smoke, but so does everyone else. This shared olfactory reality binds the army together. It is the scent of survival. When the battle comes, it is not the chaotic melee of European chivalry with its clashing swords and heavy plate armor. Mongol warfare is a discipline of flow and geometry. You do not charge blindly. You flow like water. The primary weapon is the composite bow, a masterpiece of engineering made of horn, sinew, and wood, capable of launching an arrow with lethal force over vast distances. You learn to shoot while your horse is at a full gallop. Releasing the string at the precise moment, all four of the horse's hooves are off the ground, achieving a moment of perfect stabilization. It is a dance of death. The famous feigned retreat is not cowardice. It is the ultimate psychological trap. You turn your back to the enemy, luring them into a disorganized pursuit, stretching their lines, breaking their formation, and then, at a whistle's signal, you turn in the saddle, the Parthian shot, and loose death into their unprotected faces. It is efficient, brutal, and devoid of the romanticism that clouds the judgment of your enemies. You do not count the dead. You do not seek glory in personal duels. You seek only the total disintegration of the opposing force. After the adrenaline of battle fades, the reality of the steppe returns. The nights are a test of the soul. The temperature drops to levels that freeze breath in the throat. You sleep pressed against your horse, sharing body heat, wrapped in every scrap of felt and fur you possess. The cold changes you. It strips away the frivolous parts of your personality, leaving only a stoic, hard core. You become quieter, more observant. You realize that the empire is not held together by bureaucracy, but by this shared hardness, this collective will to endure what others cannot. And at the center of this spinning world sits the Khan. He is not a distant figure on a golden throne. He is there, in a tent that is only slightly larger than yours, eating the same dried meat, enduring the same frost. His authority is absolute not because of divine right in the European sense, but because he has proven he is the wolf who leads the pack. To stand before him is to stand before the architect of your reality. His orders are brief, his expectations total. Failure is not an administrative error. It is a betrayal of the survival pact. As when you are sent as an emissary to foreign lands, you ride with the weight of this terrifying efficiency behind you. You approach the marble gates of great cities, Samarkand, Kiev, Beijing, not as a beggar, but as a harbinger. Your message is simple: submit and live, or resist and perish. There is no third option. You look upon their stone walls, their silk robes, their golden idols with a mix of amusement and pity. They believe their walls will save them. They do not understand that you are not fighting a war of positions. You are fighting a war of movement. You are the wind, and walls cannot stop the wind. When you finally arrive at Karakorum, the capital, it is a shock to the senses. It is not a city of stone cathedrals, but a metropolis of felt. Thousands of gers stretch across the valley, a mobile city that breathes. Yet, But inside this temporary appearance lies a sophisticated network of global intelligence. You see priests from the Vatican, merchants from Persia, scribes from China, all gathered under the protection of the Pax Mongolica. It is a meritocracy enforced by the sword. The Khan does not care for your lineage. He cares for your utility. Can you forge steel? Can you calculate taxes? Can you heal a wound? If yes, you are elevated. If no, you are dead weight. The laws, the yasa, are draconian but fair. Theft is punished by death or repayment ninefold. Adultery, rustling, lying to a commander, these are capital offenses. The result is a society where a virgin carrying a sack of gold could ride from one end of the empire to the other unharmed, a level of security unknown in the civilized West. But this security is bought with terror. Saint, when you ride to the edge of the empire, to the frontier where the mandate of the Khan begins to fray, you feel the true scale of what has been built. You pass the ruins of cities that chose resistance, now just mounds of bone and ash, silent monuments to the cost of pride. You see the world not as a collection of nations, but as a single grazing ground, a unified field under the eternal blue sky. You realize that you have become part of something that transcends the individual human lifespan. You are a cell in a massive, conquering organism. And though history may call you a barbarian, though the scribes of the West may paint you as a demon, you know the truth. You are the inevitable result of a world that grew too soft, corrected by a force that remembered how to survive the cold. This is the Mongol reality. A life stripped of illusion, lived at the gallop, where the only thing that matters is the strength of your bow and the loyalty of the man riding beside you. If we turn our gaze from the wind-scoured steppes of the East to the dense, brooding forests of Western Europe, we find a different kind of empire building taking place, one not defined solely by the horse and the bow, but by a potent, often contradictory fusion of the sword and the cross. While the Mongols were perfecting the art of mobile warfare, the Franks were attempting to resurrect the ghost of Rome. And at the center of this titanic effort stood a man whose shadow would stretch across the continent for a millennium: Charlemagne. To understand Charles the Great, we must first understand the fractured world he inherited, a Europe emerging from the chaotic slumber of the so-called Dark Ages, and where the concept of legitimate rule was as fluid as the borders of the petty kingdoms that dotted the map. Born around 742, likely in the Frankish heartlands, Charles was the product of a dynasty, the Carolingians, that had already proven its cunning by deposing the Merovingian puppet kings. His father, Pepin the Short, had secured the blessing of the Pope to legitimize this coup, weaving the first threads of an alliance between the Frankish throne and the Vatican that would define medieval politics. Yet the young Charles did not ascend to a unified throne. In the Germanic tradition of Gavelkind, the kingdom was sliced in half, shared with his brother Charlemagne. History teaches us that dual monarchies are rarely stable, and this was no exception. And as the brothers operated less as co-rulers and more as rival warlords in a cold war of court intrigue. It was a tense, venomous standoff that threatened to plunge the Franks into civil war, resolved only by the convenient sudden death of Charlemagne in 771. History is silent on the specific cause, offering only the vague explanation of natural causes. But for Charles, it was divine intervention. With his brother gone, he seized the entirety of the realm, ignoring the claims of his nephews, and began the relentless expansion that would earn him his epithet. Charlemagne's reign was a perpetual campaign. He was a king who lived in the saddle, moving his court from palace to palace, but mostly from battlefield to battlefield. His first great test lay to the south, with the Lombards of Italy, and it was a conflict born of personal slight and geopolitical necessity. The Lombard king Desiderius had sheltered Carlomagne's fleeing family and threatened the Papal States. Charles, ever the pragmatist, dissolved his marriage to the Lombard princess and marched his armies across the Alps, a logistical feat that mirrored the great crossings of antiquity. The siege of Pavia was a masterclass in patience, ending not in a storm of fire, but in starvation and surrender. In a move that shattered precedent, Charles did not merely defeat the Lombard king. He took the Iron Crown for himself, declaring himself king of the Franks and the Lombards, effectively erasing an entire kingdom from the board and binding the destiny of Italy to the Germanic north. Yet it was the wars to the north against the Saxons that would reveal the darker, the more zealous side of his character. This was not merely a war for territory. It was a collision of cosmologies. The Saxons were pagans, worshippers of trees and thunder, fiercely independent and resistant to the white Christ of the Franks. For 30 bloody years, Charles campaigned against them with a brutality that shocks the modern conscience. He burned their sacred groves, including the Irminsul, the pillar believed to hold up the sky, effectively declaring war on their gods. The resistance was fierce, led by the elusive Widukind, and the Frankish response was often genocidal. The massacre of Verdun, where 4,500 Saxon prisoners were purportedly beheaded in a single day, stands as a grim testament to Charlemagne's conviction that salvation could be compelled by the sword. He viewed himself as a new David, a warrior king tasked by God to shepherd the heathens into the fold, whether they wished to go or not. Baptism became a tool of subjugation. To accept the water was to accept the Frankish yoke, and to reject it was to choose death. However, to view Charlemagne only as a warlord is to miss the profound paradox of his reign. This man, whose hands were stained with the blood of thousands, was also the architect of the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning that arguably saved Western civilization from intellectual oblivion. It is a supreme irony that a man who struggled to write his own name, keeping wax tablets under his pillow to practice his letters late at night, became the greatest patron of literacy in his age. He recognized that an empire could not be run by swords alone. It required a standardized language and a competent clergy and a uniform law. He summoned the greatest minds of Europe to his court at Aachen, most notably the English scholar Alcuin of York. Together, they revolutionized education, establishing palace schools and demanding that monasteries cultivate libraries. They reformed the very script in which knowledge was recorded. The Carolingian minuscule, with its clear, rounded letters, replaced the unintelligible scrolls of the earlier era, becoming the foundation for the fonts we read today. In the scriptoriums of his empire, monks labored to copy the works of Cicero, Pliny, and Ovid, preserving the classical heritage that would otherwise have rotted in the damp decay of neglected libraries. Charlemagne understood that for the church to function, priests needed to be able to read the Bible correctly. Thus, his piety drove a scholarly explosion that illuminated the corridors of a darkened Europe. The apex of his reign, and perhaps the defining moment of the Middle Ages, occurred on Christmas Day in the year 800, in the drafty grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As Charles rose from prayer, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and acclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. It is a scene shrouded in historical ambiguity. Charles would later claim he was ambushed by the honor, a humble protest that rings somewhat hollow given the immense political benefit it conferred. In that moment, the geopolitical reality shifted. The title of emperor, vacant in the West since 476, was resurrected and bestowed upon a Germanic king. It was a direct challenge to the Byzantine Empire in the East, and a declaration that the locus of power had shifted from the Mediterranean to the heart of Europe. It fused the Germanic military tradition with Roman imperial legacy and Christian authority, creating the ideological structure that would govern Europe for 1,000 years. But a crown does not govern. Administration does. Charlemagne ruled his vast polyglot empire through a system of delegation and surveillance that was remarkably advanced for its time. He divided his realm into counties ruled by counts, but he checked their power with the missi dominici, the envoys of the Lord, pairs of inspectors, usually a layman and a cleric, who traveled the realm to ensure justice was done and taxes were collected. He issued capitularies, legislative acts that regulated everything from the conduct of bishops to the prices of grain, and even the types of vegetables to be grown in royal gardens. It was a micromanaged attempt to impose order on chaos, to create a res publica Christiana, a Christian commonwealth where the law of the king was a reflection of the law of God. Yet, like all things built by mortal hands, it was fragile. The unity of the empire depended entirely on the sheer force of personality of Charlemagne himself. He was the gravity that held the disparate tribes and territories in orbit. As he aged, the cracks began to show. The coasts were harried by Viking raiders, a foreshadowing of the storms to come. His succession plans were marred by the deaths of his promising sons, leaving only Louis the Pious, a man of great faith but lesser political instinct, to inherit the mantle. When Charlemagne died in 814, suffering from pleurisy in his beloved Aachen, he was buried seated on a throne, a final tableau of authority, but the empire he built could not survive him intact. It fractured into the kingdoms that would eventually become France and Germany, dissolving into civil war and feudal fragmentation. However, the idea of the empire did not die. Charlemagne had planted a seed deep in the European consciousness, the dream of a unified Christian West. He became the Father of Europe, a figure of legend whose court at Aachen would inspire the Arthurian romances, whose paladins would become the heroes of the chanson de geste. He had dragged Europe out of the localized stagnation of the tribal era and forced it to think in imperial terms again. He was a man of terrifying contradictions, a barbarian who cherished Latin poetry, a conqueror who preached peace, a sinner who built the church. And in the end, he proved that while empires may crumble, the myth of the emperor is immortal. If we descend from the high altitudes of imperial politics and step into the smoky, raucous interior of the medieval Great Hall, we encounter a ritual that was as vital to the social cohesion of the Middle Ages as the battlefield or the cathedral. The feast, to the modern observer, conditioned by the casual intimacy of the family dinner or the sterile efficiency of a restaurant, a medieval feast appears as a chaotic gluttony. But as a scholar of the period, I assure you it was nothing of the sort. It was a highly choreographed liturgy of power, a secular mass where the consumption of calories was secondary to the consumption of status. The feast was the stage upon which the drama of feudalism was performed, night after night. Imagine entering a hall lined with tapestries that served the dual purpose of displaying wealth and keeping out the relentless draught. The air is thick, a complex perfume of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, smoke from the central hearth, and the sharp tang of spilled wine. The noise is a wall of sound, the clatter of trenchers, the strumming of lutes, the roar of conversation, but beneath this cacophony lies a rigid structure. The seating arrangement alone is a map of the political landscape. At the far end of the hall, often on a raised dais, sits the high table. Here the lord and lady preside, physically elevated above their subjects, a visual reminder of the great chain of being. To sit here is to be in the orbit of power, to sit above the salt. That precious and imported mineral contained in an elaborate cellar in the center of the table is to be marked as elite. Below the salt, down the long wooden trestle tables that stretch towards the door, the rank descends with brutal precision. Lesser knights, squires, wealthy merchants, and finally, near the draughty entrance where the dogs fight for scraps, the retainers and servants. In this world, you are literally where you eat. Behind the scenes of this aristocratic theater lay the engine room, the kitchen. If the great hall was heaven, the kitchen was a functional hell. It was a place of extreme heat, shouting, and danger, ruled by the master cook, a figure who commanded a brigade of spit-turners, potboys, and scullions with the authority of a field marshal. There were no temperature dials, no timers, so cooking was an art of intuition and physical endurance. Massive open fires roared constantly, roasting whole oxen or boars on spits turned by young boys whose muscles ached from the repetitive labor. The scale of production was industrial. We are talking about feeding hundreds of people in waves, known as removes. The food that emerged from this inferno was designed to shock and awe. The medieval palate, contrary to the myth of blandness, craved intensity. Spices were the ultimate status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron were imported from the distant east at astronomical costs. To serve a dish heavily spiced was to essentially announce, "I have the wealth to command trade routes that stretched to the Indies." Sauces were rich, acidic, and pungent, and often thickened with breadcrumbs and sharpened with vinegar or verjuice to cut through the heavy grease of the meats. And meat was the undisputed king of the table. Vegetables were viewed with suspicion by the aristocracy, considered the food of the peasantry, stuff of the earth. The noble diet was a carnivore's dream. Venison, wild boar, swan, peacock, heron, and porpoise. The presentation was theatrical, bordering on the grotesque. A peacock would be skinned, roasted, and then redressed in its own feathers, its beak gilded, brought into the hall as if it were still alive, a zombie bird of culinary extravagance. This was food as sculpture, food as domination over nature. The entertainment was woven into the meal itself. Between the removes, the guests were not merely left to digest. They were assaulted with spectacles. And the subtlety was a masterpiece of this era. Elaborate sculptures made of sugar paste, marzipan, or jelly, depicting biblical scenes, mythical beasts, or political allegories. These were edible propaganda, designed to delight the eye and flatter the host. A sugar castle might be wheeled in, complete with firing cannons, or a giant pie might be cut open to release a flock of live birds, a trick that delighted the guests even as it likely terrified the birds. The court jester, or fool, played a crucial sociological role in this environment. Clad in his motley, he was the only person permitted to speak truth to power, using humor to prick the ego of the lord, a safety valve in a society where a misplaced word could usually mean death. Minstrels sang of the deeds of ancestors, reinforcing the lineage and legitimacy of the host. It was a multimedia experience designed to overwhelm the senses and enforce the message that the host was a man of boundless resource and culture. Yet, looming over every feast was the shadow of the church. The medieval calendar was a minefield of dietary restrictions. For nearly half the days of the year, Fridays, Lent, Advent, Ember Days, the consumption of meat was strictly forbidden. This created a theological and culinary tension. How does a nobleman display his wealth when he is forced to eat like a monk? The answer was casuistry, the art of finding loopholes. The definition of meat was stretched to its breaking point. The beaver, for instance, because it possessed a scaly tail and lived in water, was conveniently classified as a fish by some creative theologians, allowing it to be eaten on fast days. Chefs developed the art of illusion, creating bacon out of salmon or molding almond paste to look like eggs. The feast continued, but it wore a mask of piety. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, yet the feast was an essential social mechanism. This cognitive dissonance was resolved through the ritual of charity. The leftovers from the feast, and there were always massive leftovers, as abundance was the point, were not merely discarded. The alms dish was a vessel on the table where guests would deposit choice cuts of meat to be given to the poor. The trencher, a thick slab of stale bread used as a plate to absorb juices, would be gathered at the end of the meal and distributed to the beggars at the gate. Thus, the excess of the rich was justified by the sustenance it provided to the poor. And it was a trickle-down economy of calories, sanctified by prayer. The etiquette of the feast was a rigid code that separated the civilized from the savage. In a time before forks, when fingers were the primary tools, manners were paramount to prevent the meal from degenerating into a brawl. You ate with the first 3 fingers of your right hand. The left was for unclean tasks. You never returned a chewed bone to the shared dish. You did not pick your teeth with your knife. You did not spit across the table. These rules were not just about hygiene, they were about self-control. To restrain one's physical impulses in the presence of abundance was the mark of nobility. The shared cup, passed from lip to lip, was a bond of trust in an era of poisons. The washing of hands before and after the meal was a ceremonial act, and almost distinct from actual cleanliness, involving scented waters and fine linens. When the torches burned low and the guests staggered off to their beds, the great hall was left to the servants and the dogs, the silence returning to the stone walls. But the feast had done its work. Alliances had been forged over cups of wine, enemies had been assessed across the roast swan, and the hierarchy of the world had been reasserted. The feast was more than a meal, it was the metabolic rate of the body politic, the way the medieval world consumed and digested its own power structure, one trencher at a time. Now, let us leave the smoke-filled halls of continental Europe and cast our eyes northward, to a place where the map simply ran out. Here, on the razor's edge of the habitable world, we find a story not of empires or feasts, but of survival and the quiet, almost accidental discovery of a new world. This is the saga of Leif Erikson, a man born into the brutal silence of the North Atlantic, circa 970 A.D. To understand Leif, you must first understand the shadow from which he emerged, that of his father, Erik the Red. Erik was a man of the old world, violent, impulsive, a pagan force of nature who founded Greenland not out of grand vision, but because he had been exiled from everywhere else for the inconvenience of murdering his neighbors. Leif grew up in this marginal colony, a precarious settlement clinging to the edge of a frozen fjord, surviving on seal meat, driftwood, and stubbornness. Yet, where the father was fire and blood, the son was ice and contemplation. Leif was the prototype of the transitional man, straddling the fault line between the Viking age of raiding and the coming medieval order of kings and crosses. His journey began not with a voyage to the unknown, but a return to the center. As a young man, Leif sailed back to Norway, the ancestral homeland, to serve at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason. This was a crucial pivot point in history. Olaf was a Christian warrior king, determined to drag the Norse world into the fold of Christendom by the sword if necessary. Leif, ever the thoughtful observer, accepted baptism. It is easy to be cynical and see this as a political move, a way to secure trade rights and royal favor, but the sagas suggest a genuine shift in temperament. Leif returned to Greenland not just as a chieftain's son, but as a missionary, carrying a priest in his boat and a new theology in his heart. This created a profound domestic tension. His mother, Thiodhild, built the first church in the New World, a tiny sod structure where she prayed for salvation, while his father, Erik, stubbornly refused to abandon Thor and Odin, viewing his son's new faith as a betrayal of their warrior spirit. But it is the voyage west that defines Leif's legacy. Driven by the restless curiosity that defined the Norse spirit, and perhaps the whisper of tales from wayward sailors like Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had sighted land but never stepped off the boat, Leif bought a ship and set his prow toward the setting sun around the year 1000. This was not the accidental stumbling of a lost sailor. It was a calculated expedition. He navigated into the void of the Atlantic, reading the waves and the birds until he found land. First, Helluland, the land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island, a desolate, rocky slab that offered nothing but a confirmation that land existed. Then Markland, the forest land, probably Labrador, where the thick timber must have looked like gold to a man from treeless Greenland. Finally, they arrived at a place where the winter did not bite, where salmon filled the rivers, and where, allegedly, wild grapes grew in abundance. He named it Vinland. We know it today as L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Leif and his crew built sod houses, wintered there, and explored. They were the first Europeans to set foot on the North American continent, 5 centuries before Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean. Yet this was not a conquest. It was a brief, tenuous contact. They found they were not alone, and the land was inhabited by people the Norse called Skraelings, likely the ancestors of the Innu or Beothuk. The sagas describe trade, but also sudden, terrifying violence. The Norse weapon of choice was the axe and the shield wall. The indigenous people had numbers and knowledge of the terrain. So Leif, with the pragmatism that distinguished him from his father, realized a hard truth. They could not hold this land. The supply lines back to Greenland were too long, the population too small, and the neighbors too hostile. There would be no Vinland Empire. So, Leif did something that defies the archetype of the glory-seeking hero. He packed up and went home. He loaded his ship with timber and grapes, resources that would make him a wealthy man in Greenland, and sailed back east. He never returned to Vineland. He didn't need to. So he had proven it existed, he had extracted its wealth, and he had survived. Upon his return, he assumed the leadership of the Greenland colony after his father's death. He spent the rest of his days not as an adventurer, but as an administrator, a judge, and a shepherd of his people. He governed with a quiet authority, overseeing the gradual Christianization of the settlement and managing the fragile existence of his community on the edge of the world. History is often unkind to the quiet ones. Leif left no diaries, erected no great stone monuments to his own glory. His achievement was preserved only in the oral tradition of the Icelandic sagas, stories told around hearth fires during the long, dark winters, mutating and shifting with every retelling until they were finally written down centuries later. For a long time, the world forgot him. He became a myth, a ghost of the North. It wasn't until archaeology confirmed the existence of the Norse settlement in Newfoundland in the 1960s that Leif Erikson fully stepped out of the fog of legend and into the hard light of history. He stands now as a testament to a different kind of greatness. Not the greatness of the conqueror who burns cities to write his name in ash, but the greatness of the explorer who sails into the unknown, sees the world for what it is, and has the wisdom to know when to turn back. He reminds us that the map of history is not just drawn by those who stay and conquer, but also by those who visit, observe, and quietly sail home. We have traversed the vast, freezing expanses of the steppe, walked the bloody path of the Carolingian conquest, sat amidst the gluttonous spectacle of the high table, and sailed the lonely, icy currents of the North Atlantic. But to truly understand the medieval mind, the subject of our study tonight, we must step back and weave these disparate threads into a single tapestry. As a historian and a man of faith, I see in these 4 narratives not just isolated events, but a quadrant of the human experience during the Middle Ages: the terror, the order, the hunger, and the mystery. Let us reflect first on the tension between the terror and the order. The Mongol Empire and Charlemagne's Europe represent 2 opposing answers to the chaos of existence. Charlemagne sought to impose order from above, using the structures of the church and the legacy of Rome to build a fortress against the dark. He believed that if he could just write enough laws, build enough schools, and baptize enough Saxons, he could create a kingdom of heaven on earth. It was an architecture of stone and scripture, vertical and rigid. But as we saw, it was fragile. It required the constant, exhausting vigilance of the emperor to keep the walls from crumbling. Contrast this with the Mongols, They did not build walls, they rode over them. Their order was not vertical, but horizontal, spread across the horizon like the wind. They accepted the brutality of nature and weaponized it. They did not try to insulate themselves from the cold or the hunger. They became the cold and the hunger. For the settled peoples of Europe, the Mongols were not just an army. They were the apocalypse made flesh, a reminder that no amount of stone or Latin prayer could fully secure civilization against the raw, violent energy of the natural world. In the theological sense, Charlemagne represents the human desire for sanctification, the need to separate ourselves from the beast, while the Mongols represent the reality of the fall, the inescapable truth that we are creatures of blood and survival. And where do the people live? They live in the hunger. The feast we explored is not merely a quirk of aristocracy. It is a psychological defense mechanism against the precariousness of life. In a world where famine was a constant specter, where a bad harvest meant death for thousands, the feast was a defiant roar of life. To pile meat upon the table, to construct castles of sugar, to waste food in the presence of the hungry, this was a ritual of abundance designed to ward off the fear of scarcity, and it was the medieval equivalent of lighting a bonfire in the dark. It asserted that here, in this hall, for this night, we have beaten back the wolf. But as we noted, the church stood by, watching, counting the calories and the sins. This is the great paradox of the medieval soul, torn between the biological drive to consume and survive, and the spiritual imperative to fast and repent. The feast is the battlefield where the body and the spirit wrestled for control. Finally, we look to the horizon, to the mystery. Leif Erikson represents the outlier, the quiet voice that suggests there is something beyond the binary of order and terror, feast and famine. While Charlemagne looked south to Rome and the Mongols looked west to conquest, Leif looked into the void. His journey to Vinland is a theological problem as much as a geographical one. That he found a paradise, grapes, timber, mild weather, but he walked away from it. Why? Because the medieval mind knew its limits. They understood that not every door that is opened should be walked through. There is a humility in life's retreat that is missing in the modern age. We conquer because we can. He explored, saw that the time was not right, and returned to his duty. He chose his people over his pride. So, what are we to make of this era? It was not, as some Victorian historians claimed, merely a dark age waiting for the light of the Renaissance. It was a time of fierce, blinding reality. Whether it was the frostbite on a Mongol warrior's face, the ink stains on a Carolingian monk's fingers, the grease on a noble's chin, or the salt spray in a Viking's eyes, the people of this time lived with a proximity to the elements that we have lost. They understood the cost of things. They knew that civilization is a thin veneer over a violent world, that food is a blessing not to be taken for granted, and that the unknown is vast and indifferent to our ambitions. As we close the book on these chapters, we are left with the silence that follows the story. The yurts of Karakorum are gone. Return to the grass. Charlemagne's empire is dust, his throne empty. The great feasts have been eaten, the bones thrown to dogs long dead, and Vinland waits, silent, for another 500 years. But the lessons remain. We are still building walls against the wind. We are still feasting to forget the dark. We are still scanning the horizon for something new. And we are still, in our own way, like trying to survive the ride. Ladies and gentlemen, we have recounted the history. But as a theologian, I must insist that history without spiritual context is merely a chronicle of bodies colliding. To truly inhabit these worlds, to survive the Mongol steppe or the Carolingian court, we must understand not just what these men did, but who they believed was watching them. We must peel back the layer of action to reveal the layer of belief, for it is belief that fuels the engine of empire. Let us now delve deeper into the theology of survival and the clash of cosmologies that defined these eras. In the Mongol worldview, the sky was not merely an atmospheric phenomenon. It was Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, a supreme, non-anthropomorphic deity who granted the right to rule. This is crucial to understanding why you, and as a hypothetical Mongol warrior, feel no guilt in conquest. In the Christian West, war was a complicated theological problem. Augustine and Aquinas wrestled with just war theory, trying to reconcile the Prince of Peace with the necessity of the sword. Charlemagne had to perform mental gymnastics to justify slaughtering Saxons in the name of Christ. But for you, on the steppe, there is no such dissonance. Tengri ordains the order of the world. If you win, it is because heaven wills it. If you lose, it is because heaven has withdrawn its favor. There is no concept of sin in the Judeo-Christian sense of moral failing. There is only pollution or taboo, actions that offend the spirits. When Genghis Khan climbed the sacred mountain Burhan Haldun before his great campaigns, he took off his hat and his belt, hanging them around his neck to show total submission to the sky. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for power. This created a psychology of absolute, terrifying clarity. The Mongol warrior does not suffer from the neuroticism of the European knight, who is constantly worried about the state of his immortal soul. The Mongol is concerned only with loyalty and effectiveness. This spiritual pragmatism is what allowed them to incorporate other religions so easily. You could be a Christian, a Muslim, or a Buddhist in the Mongol army, provided your first loyalty was to the Khan. Why? Because the Khan was the earthly shadow of Tengri. As long as you served the Khan, your private gods were your own business. This tolerance was not born of modern liberal values. It was born of supreme confidence. And the Mongols believed their god was so big he didn't care what small rituals you performed, as long as you paid your taxes. Contrast this with the spiritual anxiety of Charlemagne's Europe. Here, the king is not just a ruler. He is the Christus Domini, the Lord's anointed. Charlemagne's coronation in 800 AD was an attempt to fuse the Germanic warrior ethos with Old Testament kingship. He looked at the Franks and saw the new Israelites. This is why the war against the Saxons was so vicious. It was not just a border dispute, it was a cosmic cleansing. To Charlemagne, a pagan Saxon was not just a foreigner. He was a glitch in the divine order, a soul in danger of hellfire. By forcing baptism at sword point, Charlemagne believed he was doing the Saxons a favor, saving them from eternal damnation, even if he had to kill their bodies to do it. And this is the heavy, suffocating weight of medieval Christian kingship. The belief that the king is responsible for the salvation of his subjects. Imagine sitting in the drafty nave of the Palatine Chapel in Aachen. You're surrounded by Roman columns hauled from Ravenna, gold mosaics, and the smell of incense. The atmosphere is heavy with judgment. The liturgy tells you that life is a vale of tears, a testing ground. Every feast, every famine, every Viking raid is read as a sign of God's pleasure or wrath. The medieval European lives in a universe that is constantly speaking to him in moral codes. If the crops fail, it is because the village has sinned. If the Vikings burn the monastery, it is because the monks were lax in their prayers. This worldview creates a society of intense introspection and communal guilt, very different from the shame-based, externalized honor culture of the steppe. And then there is the Norseman. Leif Erikson stands at the intersection of these worlds, but the bedrock of the Norse soul is neither the universalism of Tengri nor the moralism of Christ. It is fatalism. The Old Norse concept of weird, fate, dictates that the length of a man's life is determined by the norns, the weavers of fate at the moment of his birth. Nothing you do can change the day of your death. This sounds depressing to the modern ear, but for the Viking, it was incredibly liberating. If your death is already written, then you are free to act without fear. You can sail into a storm, charge a shield wall, or explore a new continent, because if it is your day to die, you will die in your bed anyway. If it is not, no weapon can harm you. This fatalism explains Leif's behavior in Vinland. Why didn't he fight harder to keep it? Why didn't he bring an army? Because the Norseman does not believe in manifest destiny. He does not believe the world was given to him to conquer. He believes the world is a chaotic place ruled by giants and fickle gods, and a man's only job is to navigate it with courage and luck. Hamingja. If the scralings are too strong, if the supply lines are too long, that is just the weave of fate. You do not force it. You turn your ship around and go home, content that you did what you could. There is a deep, stoic wisdom in this. The Christian crusader tries to bend the world to God's will. The Mongol warrior tries to trample the world under his horse's hooves. The Norse explorer simply sails the waves the world gives him. But we must also consider the theology of the body. In the medieval feast, we saw gluttony, but we must understand the spiritual dimension of food. In the Catholic Middle Ages, the body was viewed with deep suspicion. It was the vessel of sin, the brother-ass, as St. Francis called it, to be beaten into submission. And yet, the central act of the faith was the Eucharist, eating the body of God. This sacramental view of matter meant that food was never just fuel. The bread on the table was a cousin to the bread on the altar. The wine in the goblet was a symbol of the blood of Christ. This is why the etiquette of the feast was so rigid. To eat like a beast was to deny the sacred potential of the meal. The Mongol, by contrast, viewed the animal world with a totemic respect but a lack of sentimentality. But you drank the blood of your horse not as a sacrament, but as survival. The animal was a tool, a partner, provided by the sky. There was no guilt in consumption, only necessity. As we continue this examination, I want you to feel the weight of these invisible architectures. We often think of history as a series of technological advancements, the stirrup, the heavy plow, the longship. But the greatest technology of all is the idea of the divine. It was the idea of Tengri that allowed a few thousand horsemen to conquer China. It was the idea of Christendom that allowed Charlemagne to knit together the fractured tribes of Europe. And it was the quiet, lingering idea of weird that allowed Leif Erikson to face the Atlantic abyss without blinking. We are not done yet. We have looked at the kings and the captains, but what of the silence? And what of the women left behind in the jeers of the steppe while the men rode west? What of the Saxon mothers hiding their children from Charlemagne's baptismal squads? What of the indigenous people of Vinland watching the strange ships with dragon heads appear on the horizon? Their theology is the theology of endurance, the silent prayer of those who are acted upon by history rather than those who make it. We must give voice to them as well. If history is written by the victors, it is endured by the invisible. We have spent much of our time tonight gazing at the peaks of the mountain, the Khans, the emperors, the explorers. But to truly grasp the texture of the medieval world, we must descend into the valleys. We must look at the machinery of these societies, specifically through the eyes of those who fueled them, the women who managed the empires while the men burned them, and the cities that stood trembling in the path of the storm. Let us shift our perspective to the walls of a city, let us say in Khwarezmia or Rus, that has just spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. The Mongol siege was not merely a military operation, it was a psychological dismantling. Before a single stone was thrown, the Mongols waged war on the mind. They arrived not with a chaotic roar, but often with an eerie, disciplined silence. Or worse, the sound of the naked drums, deep, rhythmic, booming vibrations that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Inside the city, the theology of protection, the belief that God is on our side and these walls are strong, begins to fracture. You see, the Mongols turned the very strength of civilization against itself. Walls, which had for centuries been the ultimate guarantee of safety, suddenly became a prison. The Mongols did not just attack, they engineered. They recruited Chinese sappers and Persian engineers, combining the military sciences of the East and West. They built palisades around your city to starve you out, a technique they called the Nurge, borrowing the hunting terminology of the ring drive. You were no longer citizens, you were game. And when the bombardment began, it was not just stones. They launched pots of burning naphtha, Greek fire, and sometimes, in a display of biological warfare that predates the Geneva Convention by a millennium, the diseased bodies of the dead. The air inside the city becomes a toxic stew of smoke, plague, and panic. And the choice offered, surrender and serve, or resist and perish, is a theological crisis. To surrender is to submit to a heathen power, to abandon your king and your God. To resist is to condemn your wife and children to death. In this crucible, the fragility of the civilized world is exposed. The Mongol approach was binary and terrifyingly rational. Human life was a resource. If you were useful, an artisan, a scribe, a beauty, you were harvested. If you were an obstacle, you were removed. This lack of malice, this industrial approach to death, is what terrified the chroniclers of Europe more than anything. It was not the rage of a barbarian, it was the cold calculation of a new world order. Yet, while the men were breaking cities, who was holding the world together? We must speak of the women. In the Mongol Empire, the popular image of the oppressed harem girl is vastly incomplete. The Mongol woman, the Khatun, was a force of formidable political agency. Because the men were constantly on campaign, the women managed the economy of the tribe. They oversaw the herds, the trade, the logistics of the camp, and the raising of the next generation of warriors. When Genghis died, and later his son Ogedei, it was the women, Toragain Khatun, Sorgagtani Beki, who ruled as regents, maneuvering their sons onto the throne and holding the largest empire in history, together with a grip of iron. Sorgagtani, a Nestorian Christian, is arguably one of the most brilliant political minds of the 13th century, a woman who manipulated the chaotic succession politics to ensure all 4 of her sons became Khans. She understood the power of religious tolerance better than most popes, patronizing Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism simultaneously to keep the peace. These women did not hide behind veils. They rode, they advised, and they ruled. Contrast this with the Frankish court of Charlemagne. Here, women played a more subtle yet vital game. They were the peace weavers. In a fractured Europe, a noblewoman was the currency of diplomacy. You were married off to a rival count or a foreign king, not for love, but to seal a treaty. Your body was the wax on the seal, but do not mistake this for passivity. The Carolingian queens were the gatekeepers of the palace. They managed the royal treasury, often kept in the queen's bedroom for safety, and most importantly, they managed the king's soul. It was often the wives who drove the Christianization of the heathen kings. Clotilde converted Clovis. Bertha prepared the way for Augustine in Kent. They used the pillow talk of the bedchamber to whisper the will of the church into the ears of violent men. If the Mongol woman was a CEO managing a mobile corporation, the Frankish woman was a diplomat operating behind enemy lines. And then we return to the north, to the icy waters of the Atlantic, where we encounter a figure like Friedis Eriksdottir, Leif Erikson's sister. If the sagas are to be believed, she was a woman who makes Lady Macbeth look like a nun. In the saga of the Greenlanders, there is a chilling scene in Vinland. The Norse camp is attacked by the indigenous Skraelings. The men, panicked by the sheer number of attackers and their strange, whirring sling weapons, begin to flee. Friedis, heavily pregnant and unable to keep up, turns on her own countrymen, berating them for their cowardice. "Why do you run from these wretches?" she screams. "If I had a weapon, I think I could fight better than any of you." When the attackers close in, she snatches up a sword from a fallen dead man, tears open her tunic to expose her breast, and slaps the flat of the blade against her bare skin, shrieking a battle cry. The sight is so terrifying, so primal and unhinged, that the attackers flee in confusion. Whether this happened exactly as written or as a literary embellishment, it tells us something profound about the Norse view of gender. A woman was not just a domestic creature. She was a vessel of fury. In the absence of male courage, the woman could and would assume the mantle of the warrior. She is the archetype of the shield maiden, not as a fantasy, but as a survival necessity in a world where everyone had to fight to live. Finally, we must look at the silence of the peasantry, the 90% of the population that history books often ignore. For the serf in Charlemagne's fields, the grand questions of empire and papacy were irrelevant. Life was a cycle of mud, harvest, and tax. The terror was not a Mongol invasion. It was a late frost. The feast was not a roast peacock. It was a bowl of pottage thick enough to stand a spoon in. Their theology was simple and tactile. Saints who could cure a toothache, holy wells that could heal a cow. They lived in a world where the spiritual and the magical were indistinguishable. And yet they endured. They built the cathedrals they were not allowed to sit in the front of. They grew the grain for the feasts they were not invited to. They died in the wars declared by kings they would never meet. In the grand calculus of survival, they were the bedrock. You wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire. True. But would you last a day as a Frankish serf in February, with the firewood running low and the wolves scratching at the door? That, my friends, is a test of endurance that rivals any campaign on the steppe. As we prepare to close this circle, we must realize that these disparate worlds, the yurt, the palace, the long ship, were beginning to touch. The 13th and 14th centuries would see these isolated bubbles collide. The Mongols would bring the Black Death to the gates of Kaffa, hurling it into Europe and changing the demography of the West forever. So the descendants of Charlemagne would launch crusades that would end in disaster. The Norse would retreat from America, leaving it a mystery for another age. The world was shrinking. The global system was being born in blood and trade. And we, sitting here in the comfort of the modern age, are the inheritors of their survival. We carry their genes, their languages, and their traumas. We are here because they refused to die,